Welcome and thank you for joining today's Department of Market Monitoring 2025 Q1 Market Issues and Performance Report public call. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the participant and chat panel by using the associated icons on the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Please note that all audio connections are in listen-only mode. You may submit written questions throughout the presentation via the chat panel, and we will stop throughout to address questions. To ask a question, open the chat, select all panelists from the drop-down menu, enter your questions in the message box provided, and send. To indicate you wish to ask a question verbally, click the raise hand icon located on the bottom right of the participant panel. If you are not logged into WebEx, dialing *3 will place you in the question queue. If you require any technical assistance, please send a chat to the host. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Ryan Kurlinski, Senior Manager for the DMM.
Thanks, Ahmed. Let's see. I'm going to try to share my presentation here. All right. All right, you see my cover slide, Ahmed?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, thank you very much. All right, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Sorry, one more thing to set up here. All right, yeah, great. All right, thanks for joining us today, everybody. I'm Ryan Kurlinski, a manager in the Department of Market Monitoring. I'll be going over trends and highlights from our recently published Q1 2025 report on market issues and performance. This is the work of the work in the report and the slides I'll be presenting now. I'll be presenting the work of everybody in DMM. And I'll just be presenting their work today. With that, oh, and also in terms of questions as we get going here, definitely prefer verbal questions. If you feel like you need to put them in the chat, go ahead and do that. I'll be stopping. I'm not going to stop for each hand being raised or everything in the chat. I'll try to stop at certain natural breakpoints throughout this talk today. We should have some time to answer some questions if all goes well. All right. Go on to the first content slide, hopefully. All right. So this chart shows monthly average natural gas prices at major gas hubs around the West, as well as at the Henry Hub, which is a national reference point for natural gas prices. Unlike the last several quarters, there was not a clear story about the direction of gas price movement and its link to electricity prices. Gas prices were down at more northern hubs and they were up at more southern hubs compared to the first quarter of 2024. Gas prices at Northwest Sumas, it's a major hub in the Pacific Northwest, those were down 33% from the first quarter of 2024, while prices at PG&E Citygate were down just slightly. They were down about 3%. Gas prices at Northwest Opal in Wyoming, those were up slightly, right, up about 2%. But at more southern hubs, gas prices were up more compared to the first quarter of 2024. So SoCal Citygate prices were up 28%. El Paso Permian prices were up 29%. And Henry Hub gas prices were up 76% compared to the first quarter of 2024. All right. This graph shows the load-weighted average monthly 15-minute market price for each WEIM region. 15-minute market prices across the WEIM averaged about $37 per megawatt hour this quarter. That's down about 39% compared to the first quarter of 2024. And that was despite the mixed story on gas prices, and despite load being about 2% higher on average. So this decrease was largely due to the absence of the extreme cold weather events that occurred in the Pacific Northwest in the middle part of January 2024. That cold spell, it created abnormally high prices that month across the WEIM, especially as we can see here up in the Pacific Northwest and Intermountain West. So the first quarter of 2025 saw a return to more normal first quarter prices. The highest average prices over the quarter were in PowerX at $43 per megawatt hour, and in the Pacific Northwest in California at about $40 per megawatt hour. And we'll talk about this on the next few slides. Midday south to north congestion that contributed to elevating Pacific Northwest prices compared to other regions. And greenhouse gas costs in California, they continued to be the major cause of higher prices in California during the non-solar hours. The blue line in this chart shows average 15-minute market prices for the whole quarter for each balancing area. The balancing areas are sorted from left to right in descending order of their average 15-minute market prices. Each balancing area's average price is decomposed into its components, such as congestion from constraints in the CAISO balancing area, those are the yellow bars. Congestion from constraints in other WEAM balancing areas are shown by turquoise bars. The greenhouse gas constraint contribution, that's the green bars. And congestion from WEAM transfer constraints, those are shown by the red bars. So the south to north congestion during midday solar hours, that was a major driver of price separation between balancing areas. Looking first at the turquoise bars on the lower right side of the chart. We see congestion on constraints in New Mexico, decreasing prices in both the Public Service Company of New Mexico and in the El Paso electric balancing areas. Congestion on constraints in the CAISO balancing area, that's the yellow bars, that tended to decrease prices in the desert Southwest and Southern California relative to the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, and also a couple of balancing areas in the Intermountain West. And finally, the red bars are showing congestion on WEIM transfer constraints increasing prices in the Pacific Northwest relative to other areas. So also noteworthy, the green bars right below the horizontal axis, those show the greenhouse gas costs for power in California, and that was the main contributor to elevating prices in California balancing areas relative to other WEIM balancing areas during the non-solar hours in the evening and early morning. All right, this chart is also showing load-weighted average WEIM 15-minute market prices for each region. But the colored lines in this graph show each hour's average cost for the first quarter for each region. That's measured on the left axis. The gray bars show WEIM system-wide average net load for each hour, and those values are listed on the right axis. So this graph shows that most of that south to north price separation that occurred during the midday solar hours, and that's when we're at the CAISO balancing area had extra solar, which the market sent to all the other WEIM regions, including the other balancing areas in California. This caused congestion on major south to north transmission corridors, that's including WEAM transfer constraints into northwestern balancing areas. So you see during the solar hours, prices in the Pacific Northwest were significantly higher than the rest of the WEIM. But during non-solar hours, prices in WEIM regions outside of California are pretty well converged on average. The California prices there in the blue line during evening, early morning hours, that were driven higher mainly by greenhouse gas costs during this first quarter. And then reassuringly, the shape of 15-minute market prices followed the WEIM system net load shape. That's the gray bars. And you can see this pattern was most pronounced in the California, desert Southwest, and Intermountain West regions. And also noteworthy is looking at, see average prices were higher during the morning peak than the evening peak in most regions this quarter. Okay, so actually this is a good spot to stop for some questions about some prices. So Matt, if you want to queue people up, if there's any questions.
To enter the question queue, click the WebEx raise hand icon on the lower right-hand corner of the participant panel. For those not logged into WebEx and are just dialed in on the phone, dialing *3 to enter the queue. You will hear a beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, please state your name, organization, and office. You may also submit questions via chat, and to do that, you can open the chat panel, select all panelists from the drop-down menu, enter your question in the message box provided, and send. Okay, we currently don't have any questions.
All right then, thank you, Ahmed. Key jamming then. This graph shows average 5-minute market net flows of WIM transfers between regions for each hour of the first quarter of 2025. Export transfers out of a region are shown as negative, and import transfers into a region are shown as positive. During midday solar hours, the CAISO balancing area there in the light blue, that was the main exporter of WEIM transfers. They were transferring power to the other regions, in particular, right, the non-CAISO California balancing areas in dark blue, the Pacific Northwest, that's the green bars, and the Desert Southwest, that's the red bars. During the evening and early morning non-solar hours, WIM transfers were mainly from the Intermountain West and Desert Southwest to CAISO and the Pacific Northwest. And this graph shows the same 5-minute market net flows of WIM transfers between regions for each hour, but we show it for each of the last 5 quarters. And again, export transfers out of a region are shown as negative, and import transfers into a region are shown as positive. The Intermountain West region became the dominant exporter of WIM transfers during non-solar hours, and that's a new development. Looking back to the first quarter of 2024, on the left of this graph, we see the Intermountain West region, that's the yellow bars, with a net supplier of WIM transfers, out during these hours, but the volume of net transfers out of that region in the evening and early morning hours was pretty low. It increased significantly in the first quarter of 2025. And as we'll see in a few slides, the Intermountain West had a large year-over-year increase in wind generation across all hours on average, and that contributed to more WEIM transfers flowing out of the region and ultimately onto California during those non-solar hours. All right, this graph shows the average 5-minute market net flows of WIM transfers between specific balancing areas and during the hours ending 19 to 22. That's the average over the first quarter of 2025. The inner ring that shows the balancing area that the transfer is exporting out of, and the colored bar, or whatever you call that, the colored taffy string, kind of goes from there to the importing balancing area. So kind of looking at the Intermountain West region there, right? This chart shows that during hours 19 to 22, PacifiCorp East and Idaho Power were the main exporters of WEIM transfers. And we're going to Nevada Power, Arizona Public Service, and PacifiCorp West. But then, looking at those areas, you see that those transfers then kind of continued out of those areas. So much of that power ultimately went on to the CAISO balancing area from the Intermountain West. The left axis of this graph shows the percent of intervals that transfer constraints into or out of each WEM balancing area were binding on the 5-minute market this quarter. The red bars show frequency of congestion into the area, and the green bars show the frequency of congestion out of the area. The diamonds, so kind of the bluish diamonds, show the average impact of transfer congestion on the balancing area's 5-minute market prices. BC Hydro, or Powerex, stands out, right? That was the most import constrained relative to the CAISO balancing area. And it was import constrained in around 60% of intervals. And it was export constrained in about 20% of intervals. Most of the rest of the Pacific Northwest, plus Avista, Northwestern Energy, they were import constrained relative to the CAISO balancing area in about 13% of intervals and export constrained in about 9% of intervals. All right, move on to looking at day-ahead and bilateral prices here. The yellow and green lines show monthly average peak period bilateral power prices at the Mid-Columbia and Palo Verde trading hubs from ICE. The dashed black and gray lines that show the monthly average ISO market day-ahead prices at the Pacific Gas and Electric and the Southern California Edison load nodes. Those average ISO market prices those are for the same hours as the bilateral peak period products, and that's hours 7 to 22 on all days but Sundays and holidays. So the ISO day market prices averaged about $41 per megawatt hour, and that was down about 15% from the first quarter of 2024. This graph shows that the trend of higher prices in northern regions and lower prices in southern regions that also applied in the day-ahead markets. Right, so we see bilateral day-ahead prices at Mid-C higher than bilateral prices at Palo Verde, and the ISO market day-ahead prices at Pacific Gas and Electric are higher than the ISO day-ahead prices at the Southern California Edison. Sorry, so the solid black line here is the same. That's the same bilateral Mid-C price from the last graph. The light blue line is the same ISO market day-ahead Pacific Gas and Electric price. But this graph adds the monthly load-weighted average WEIM 15-minute market price for load nodes and balancing areas in the Pacific Northwest. That's the dashed black line. And this graph also adds the average 15-minute market Pacific Gas and Electric price. That's the dashed light blue line. So this chart shows that Mid-C bilateral prices reverted back to a trend that we had seen for most of the last couple of years, aside from the fourth quarter of 2024. Right, so we see in Q1 2025, Mid-C bilateral prices were again higher than WEIM prices in the Pacific Northwest. The Mid-C prices were higher than day-ahead and 15-minute market prices at Pacific Gas and Electric. So that fourth quarter of 2024 looks like it may have been an anomaly in terms of those bilateral Mid-C prices dipping below comparable ISO market prices. And this chart is just like the chart from the last slide, but for the Desert Southwest. The solid red line is the monthly average day-ahead bilateral price at Palo Verde. And the dashed red line is a comparable WEIM 15-minute market price. It's the load-weighted average price for load nodes in balancing areas in the Desert Southwest. The chart also includes the ISO market day-ahead and 15-minute market prices at the Southern California Edison load node. Those are the solid yellow and dashed yellow lines. So I'll make the same point on this slide as I did on the last one. Bilateral prices at Palo Verde were consistently higher than ISO 50-minute market prices in the Desert Southwest balancing areas for the quarter. And those Palo Verde prices were higher than ISO 15-minute and day-ahead market prices at Southern California, Edison. All right, so I could stop again here for questions if anybody wants to raise their hand before I get on to load and supply conditions. I just want to just see if anybody wants to raise their hand.
There are currently no raised hands.
All right, I'll keep going then. All right, this chart shows the distribution of WEIM system load for the fourth quarter of 2025. That's in the solid blue line. And this data is the 5-minute market load forecast. The dashed line is the load distribution for the first quarter of 2024. The area under either of these curves sums up to 1. So the area under any particular load segment is the proportion of 5-minute market intervals with load in that load range. Let's see. So this distribution, it shows more instances of high system loads, particularly above about 85 gigawatts in the first quarter of 2025 compared to the same quarter last year. Right, see that the blue line is generally above the gray dashed line over 85 gigawatts, meaning greater frequency of high load intervals. At the lower end of the load range, the blue line falls below the dashed line, indicating fewer load intervals in the first quarter of 2025, and that's kind of especially below about 68 gigawatts, where those we see the blue and dashed lines intersect there, below 70 gigawatts. Average WEIM system load for the quarter was about 75.7 gigawatts, and that's up about 2% from the first quarter of 2024. Yeah, it's kind of a tricky chart, but it's interesting for this quarter, so I'll try to talk you through it. The top row of this figure shows the highest 5-minute market system load forecast for each hour on the day February 12th, 2025. Right, that's the day with the highest system load during the quarter, February 12th. The figure also shows load forecast data for each balancing area for the same 5-minute interval as the highest system load for each hour was. Right, so WEIM system load peaked this quarter at 99.7 gigawatts on February 12th. That's during hour ending 8, interval 5. That's the red box in the top row. This 99.7 gigawatts was lower than the peak WEIM load during the first quarter of 2024, which was 103 gigawatts. This heat map shows the hour. It also, so it shows the hour with the peak load for each balancing area on this day in red. And yellow boxes are for hours with above average load for the day for each balancing area. So I think interesting point in this table is, right, you can see that peak load for balancing areas varied across hours. Only 7 balancing areas had their peak loads for the day during hour 8, right? That's the hour of the overall system peak. And lots of balancing areas in California and the Desert Southwest had their peak loads for the day in the evening. All right, for the next few slides, we will be looking at supply conditions. The next 4 slides, the figures in them show changes in supply in kind of the 4 WEIM regions, and those are changes from the first quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of 2025. Positive values show an increase in the fuel type compared to the first quarter of 2024. Negative values show a decrease in the fuel type, and the black line estimates the hourly average increase or decrease in load. See, not shown here directly, right? But overall, for the WEIM footprint, average hourly solar production was up about 1,900 megawatts, and wind production was up about 840 megawatts. But in this chart, we can see that a lot of that increase in both solar and wind came from balancing areas in the desert Southwest. We're also seeing battery charging increase significantly during solar hours, and battery discharging increased quite a bit during evening hours in the desert Southwest. Battery discharge also increased significantly in hours 6 and 7, those hours right before solar production begins. Much of the rest of the WEIM's year-over-year growth in solar output came from the California region. Similar to the desert Southwest, there were large increases in battery charging during midday solar hours and large increases in battery discharge during evening hours, kind of going through the early morning hours, also right before solar production begins again for the day. Noteworthy here is the increase in coal generation in California. Those are the black bars just above the horizontal axis. This is from a large coal plant in Utah. It's contracted to provide power to the several utilities in California. A big portion of that plant was on outage during the first quarter of 2024. It came off outage during the third quarter of 2024. So that shows up here as an increase in coal generation for California this quarter compared to a year ago. The Intermountain West region had significant reductions in net WEIM transfers into the region, right, as it became a major net exporter during non-solar hours, like we discussed earlier. It had large reductions in net bilateral imports into the region as well. And note that much of the increase in the WEIM system wind production came from balancing areas in the Intermountain West, and so that was a major contributor to the Intermountain West becoming kind of the dominant exporter of WEIM transfers out during those non-solar hours. Across the WEIM system, hydro production increased on average by over 2,100 megawatts. And we can see here that this increase almost all came from the Pacific Northwest. The hydro production increase helped to meet the large increase in load in the region, and it contributed to lower net imports and and also lower net WEIM transfers into the region during the non-solar hours. Okay, it's another good place to stop for questions. Any questions about prices or load or supply? See if anybody has a hand raised. I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
There are currently no questions.
All right, then. All right. Congestion rent and loss surpluses. They're collected in the day-ahead market. Congestion rent accrues from load paying more for the congestion component of the locational marginal price at load nodes than generators get paid for the congestion component price at generation nodes. Quarterly congestion rent shown here in the blue and yellow bars. The yellow bars show the congestion rent specifically from intertie constraints. The blue bars show congestion rent from internal transmission constraints. In Q1 2025, congestion rent was $231 million. It's down $29 million, or 11% from the first quarter of 2024. We can see that the rent from internal constraints was actually up significantly this quarter from a year ago, but overall congestion rent was down due to a huge decrease in intertie congestion rent compared to the first quarter of 2024. Intertie congestion rent in the first quarter of 2025 is $9 million, down from $133 million in the first quarter of 2024. As we can see from the yellow bars across this graph, that large intertie congestion rate in the first quarter of 2024 was an outlier, right? It's driven by the severe cold weather event in the Pacific Northwest in mid-January 2024. I think, that $9 million intertie congestion rent in the first quarter of 2025 is more typical for first quarters. The loss surplus shown in the green bars here, that accrues from the difference between what load pays into the market for the loss component of LMP and what generators get paid for the loss component of LMP. The loss surplus was up a little bit, about $7 million in the first quarter of 2025 compared to a year earlier. Now, despite day-ahead system energy prices being down about 15% and load being only slightly higher. All right. This graph shows quarterly congestion revenue right auction revenues received by transmission ratepayers. Those are the blue bars. And it's showing payments made to those auction CRRs based on day-ahead market congestion rents. Those are the green bars. When the auction revenues received by ratepayers are less than the payments made out to those auction CRRs, then the transmission ratepayers lose money from the CRR auction process. And those net losses are shown by the gold line. This quarter, transmission ratepayers lost about $19.3 million from the CRR auction design. This was about 8% of total day-ahead market congestion rent. Reforms to the CRR auction design in 2019 that included what are known as Track 1B enhancements. Those enhancements limited the payouts to CRRs to just the congestion rents actually collected on each constraint in the day-ahead market. In the first quarter of 2025, these Track 1B enhancements reduced payments out to CRRs and that non-load serving entities bought in the auction, reduces payouts by about $26 million. So those enhancements are significantly reducing overall ratepayer losses from the auction design. All right. Assistance energy transfers. That's an optional program that WEIM entities can opt into on a daily basis. If opted in and the area fails a resource sufficiency evaluation test, the balancing area gets charged the bid cap. That's typically $1,000 per megawatt hour. So it gets charged that for the lower of the amount by which the area failed resource sufficiency test or the total amount of WEIM transfers scheduled into the area. So why would areas opt in? Opting into assistance energy transfers, that it can allow the area to get extra transfers that they may not have been able to receive if they had not opted in. If not opted in, when an area fails a resource sufficiency test, the area's transfers in are limited to what the area transferred in during the prior interval. But if an area is opted into assistance energy transfers, then they can receive transfers in that are greater than that, right, when they fail the test. So this table shows the WEIM transfers that each balancing area received in excess of the transfers they would have received had they not opted in to assistance energy transfers. All right, so now the points to make on this. 7 WEIM entities opted into assistance energy transfers for at least one day during the first quarter of 2025. And all 7 received WEIM transfers that were in excess of what they would have received if they had not opted in. I'll look here at Northwestern Energy. Right, they had the most failures while opted in, 37. And they received a significant amount of additional megawatt hours of transfers due to opting in. Got 198 additional megawatt hours. But their cost for additional WEIM transfer was low, right, because the amount that typically failed the test by was small. Right, so that limited the number of megawatt hours that they got charged $1,000 per megawatt hour bid cap for. PacifiCorp West, on the other hand, paid almost $947 per megawatt hour for each of the 96 additional megawatt hours of transfers that they got from having opted into assistance energy transfers. And this indicates that they frequently fail the test by more megawatts than they transferred in after failing a resource efficiency evaluation test. All right, let's stop there again for questions. A couple more complicated things in the market.
To enter the question queue, click the WebEx raise hand icon located on the lower right corner of the participant panel. For those not logged into WebEx or are just dialed in on the phone, dialing *3 will enter you into the queue. You'll hear a beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, please state your name, organization, and question. There are no raised hands.
Okay. Keep going. All right, so make a point here. I've been making the last several quarterly report presentations I've done on RUC adjustments and its relationship to the extended day and markets imbalance reserve up demand curve. The CAISO balancing area uses adjustments to the residual unit commitment market load forecast in order to procure extra capacity to cover uncertainty between what the day-ahead net load forecast is and what the actual net load may end up being, right? So that the CAISO balancing area looks at system conditions to determine which percentile of uncertainty in the day-ahead net load forecast that may materialize in real time that CAISO thinks it needs the capacity to cover. CAISO chooses to adjust the load forecast to cover the 97.5th percentile of potential uncertainty, or the 75th or the 50th percentile, or to make no adjustment at all. To make no adjustment at all, it means that they're not procuring capacity to cover any potential uncertainty that may materialize. All right, so this graph shows average RUC adjustments that the CAISO made each day over the peak morning and evening hours from May 7th, 2024 through March 31st, 2025. And the color coding shows DMM's estimate of which percentile of uncertainty adjustment was intended to try to cover. During the first quarter, DMM estimates that CAISO did not attempt to procure capacity to cover the 97.5th percentile of a potential net load uncertainty on any days at all. CAISO targeted the 75th percentile on 6 days, and they targeted the 50th percentile of uncertainty on 4 days. But during the rest of the quarter, that's 89% of days, no adjustment was applied to procure capacity to cover uncertainty. The percentile of uncertainty CAISO is aiming to cover with the RUC adjustment, right, that has implications for the extended day markets imbalance reserve product demand curve. That's because the RUC adjustment is meant to procure capacity to cover the same net load uncertainty that the imbalance reserve up product is intended to cover. However, the imbalance reserve up product demand curve is designed to pay $25 per megawatt hour to get capacity to cover the 97.5th percentile of uncertainty in all hours of all days. And as you can see, right, from the CAISO's use of the RUC adjustment over the last few quarters, CAISO rarely needs to procure capacity to cover the 97.5th percentile of uncertainty. On most hours, most days, right, CAISO relies on capacity that does not have an ISM or RUC award to show up in real time to meet most net load uncertainty that may materialize. And so I think our main point is that the low number of hours in which the CAISO uses the 97.5th percentile targeted RUC that indicates that the imbalance reserve product demand curve may be much too high during most hours. In going over flexible ramping product settlement details with the market participant last quarter, DMM became aware of a discrepancy in how the ISO settles two identical sources of supply of flexible ramping product. As this diagram shows, when there is a price for upward flexible ramping product, supply that is scheduled in the advisory interval to meet the expected or forecasted ramp, right? That supply for the next interval should get paid the flexible ramping product up price, right? As should unloaded capacity that's available to meet potential uncertainty in the net load forecast. So WM balancing area, right? It can include as generation in its base schedule, or as generation for meeting its base load. It can include bilateral imports from non-WEM balancing areas, as well as bilateral imports from WEM balancing areas. These are identical sources of supply that should not be settled differently from each other. Both are self-scheduled in the market at their base schedule level, and so they do not receive energy settlements. But we think both should count towards meeting the flexible ramping product's forecasted movement. The ISO settles bilateral hourly block imports from non-WAM balancing areas as flexible ramping product forecasted movement, but the ISO does not settle the same bilateral hourly block imports coming from WAM balancing areas as FRP forecasted movement. And DMEM recommends that the ISO change this policy and give these identical sources of supply identical settlement treatment, because the current policy could create disincentives for WAM areas to procure bilateral imports from other WAM areas, and potentially could cause them to favor procuring bilateral imports from non-WEM areas instead. Continuing on with this point here, this graph shows DMM's estimates of what each WEM balancing area would have been paid or charged over all of 2024 if the ISO had settled imports and exports from and to WEM balancing areas as forecasted movement in the flexible ramping product settlements. If the balancing area would have received more payments, as is shown as positive in this chart, if the balancing area would have been charged more, it is shown as negative here. And let's see, we can see that over 2024, the dollar impact of not settling bilateral imports and exports at WM balancing areas as flexible ramping product forecasted movement, the impact of that was pretty limited for most balancing areas. However, we estimate BPA would have received about $1.2 million in additional payments, and Public Service Company of New Mexico would have been charged about $600,000 more, right, if the ISO had treated bilateral imports and exports with the WM balancing areas consistently with how it treats imports and exports with non-WM balancing areas in its flexible ramping product settlements. All right, I just have a couple more slides I could go over, but let's stop there for any questions.
There are currently no raised hands and no questions in the chat.
All right, then. Drive on to the finish line. This chart shows average procurement of upward flexible ramping products in the 15-minute market by hour and by fuel type, and that's for balancing areas in the system pass group. That's the balancing areas that have passed the resource efficiency evaluation tests for the interval. We see that most of the upward flexible ramping product procurement is from batteries, that's the red bars, and from hydro resources, that's the light blue bars. But it is interesting that in the middle of the day, we do see some upward procurement from solar resources. My last substantive slide here. So this is the same chart, but it shows procurement of downward flexible ramping product by hour and fuel type, so upward. We see solar is the largest provider of downward flexible ramping product during midday solar hours. We can also see that that wind provides a significant amount of downward flexible ramping product across all hours. And batteries are a major source of downward FRP, especially in those evening and early morning non-solar hours. All right, with that, let's stop one more time for questions. And this is my last substance slide.
To enter the question queue, click the WebEx raise hand icon located on the lower right corner of the participant panel. For those not logged into WebEx and are just dialed in on the phone, dialing *3 will put you in the queue. You'll hear a beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, please state your name, organization, and question. You can also submit questions via chat. Open the chat panel, select all panelists from the drop-down menu, enter your question in the message box provided, and hit send. Okay, there are currently no questions.
Okay, all right. Well, all right, thank you everyone for joining us today. For more information on the Department of Market Monitoring, you can go to our website. We should post these slides and this recording, this presentation on that website within the next few days. And also, as always, we're at Department of Market Monitoring. We're here to report on the markets, help people understand the markets. So please, if you have any questions about this report or anything else in the markets, please do reach out to us. I got some email addresses there. We look forward to talking to people if you have any questions. And if not, I will speak to you all again at our presentation on the 2024 annual report, we should be doing next month. Thank you very much. That's it. Please end the call on this.